Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's a review for The Price, which is episode 8 of season 3 of Star Trek Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek Next Generation, one episode at a time. In this video I cover the third season episode, The Price. So The Price is the episode where the Enterprise is hosting negotiations for a stable wormhole to the Gamma Quadrant, and several different diplomats and negotiators come on board to negotiate with the Barzans who control the wormhole, including a Federation diplomat, and there's also a human diplomat who represents the Chrysales, who is a gun for hire named Devanali Ra. He sparks up a romance with Deanna Troi, and he is easily the most fierce negotiator, even though the Ferengi show up and cause some problems. However, Data and Geordi soon discover that the wormhole is unstable. In fact, has taken them to the Delta Quadrant instead of the Gamma Quadrant. And by this time, Deanna Troi finds out that Devanali Ra is part Betazoid, and he uses his Betazoid senses to manipulate his opponents in the negotiation table. And he realizes that he's going to lose this negotiations to Riker. So he stages a fake conflict between the Ferengi and the Enterprise in order to scare the Barzans into signing with him. But once he does, they realize that the wormhole is useless, and he had just bought a useless wormhole anyway. And he then goes to Troi and asks her to run away with him because she makes him a better person, but she tells him that I already have a job as a counselor, and he leaves without saying goodbye. So first thing I gotta say, I just gotta get it out of the way, is at the price, no price. No price. If you hadn't seen my review for The Battle, that's a reference to that episode, the first season episode, where the Ferengi, they weren't quite as bad as they were in the last Outpost, but they were still sort of acting like morons, and that's something I always that fun of, and throughout my life, whenever I watched this episode or heard about this episode or mentioned this episode, that line would pop in my head of the Ferengi saying no price. Now I was gonna put this as a cold open, but I already did that for The Battle, and I thought, well, I could just do another version, or I could even copy and paste the cold open from The Battle and put it on this, but I was like, nah, that's just repeating the same thing, because that dialogue is from The Battle, so it makes more sense to put it in my review for The Battle. But because this episode is called The Price, I always think, and it features the Ferengi, I always think of the Ferengi going, no price. Anyway, just had to throw that out. But since I'm on the topic of the Ferengi, I guess I might as well start there. This is the first episode that the Ferengi are seen as the sort of comedic goofballs that they will be for the rest of the franchise. It really started here with this episode. Now, you could say that there were kind of goofballs in The Battle, but not really. I think in both The Last Outpost and The Battle, they were goofy in The Last Outpost, that's for sure, but they were still portrayed more as a serious adversary rather than just comic relief, which is what their lot in life will be from this point forward, barring some few minor examples. But for the most part, they turned them into comedy, which is the right thing to do. Either that or just not go back to them at all. But I think it's probably smarter, even though the Ferengi, whenever they appear in episodes, they tend not to be good. The episodes, that is. And this is especially true of Deep Space Nine. Usually Ferengi episodes are my by far my least favorite episodes of Deep Space Nine. I wish that, I don't like Quark episodes, and Quark as a character is pretty cool, and so is Rom and Nog, but whenever they do full-on Ferengi episodes, they're just terrible, and I think that Deep Space Nine as a whole would have been a better show if they had just, not done that. Just, gotten rid of the whole Ferengi thing. And so, but I think it makes sense to bring them back as a comedic, entity rather than abandon them entirely, because they've already been introduced. You've already said that they're this, major superpower out there in reference. So just to pretend that they don't exist, I think it's better to actually acknowledge they exist, and have them be goofballs. Now, granted, you probably didn't need to bring them back as frequently as you did. In fact, when our Stephen Bear first heard that they were introducing a Ferengi as a main character on Deep Space Nine, he was like, no, don't do that. God, why would you do that? But then, of course, ended up falling in love with Quark, because, as I said, Quark is a special case, and they actually wrote him very well. But anyway, yeah, so the Ferengi only appeared in the last Outpost, the battle, and then a brief cameo in Peak Performance before this episode. So in the last Outpost and the battle, they were portrayed as the main adversaries. That both those episodes were made when Gene Roddenberry and the producers were convinced that they were trying to create this new bad guy, the main villain for the Enterprise D. But after, those two episodes failed, and more specifically the Ferengi failed and weren't received well, they were abandoned, and instead the Romulans were brought in instead to be the main villain, which was a super, super smart move. And they popped up again, as I said, for a brief cameo in Peak Performance, which they were still kind of adversarial. They were threatening to destroy the Enterprise, but they weren't really perceived as the main enemy that the Federation was most concerned about. They were just kind of opportunists because they saw what they thought was something valuable, and they came and tried to steal it. So they were akin to pirates, really, in that episode, and they barely appeared in that episode. So this is really the first episode where they decided to keep the Ferengi, but change them into comedy goofballs instead of a serious adversary. And I think they work very well, particularly in this episode. I actually do think they work well. I think that bit with, especially since they're not like the main characters. Like the main character, the main guest star, or the main sort of adversary that's driving the plot is definitely Rom, not the Ferengis. Now, that they do work well in this episode, though, because the scene where Damon Goss first comes on board and he brings his aides, and Picard's trying to tell him that everyone agreed not to bring aides, to just have one representation, but Damon Goss keeps interrupting him about chairs and saying, "All right, can you bring us some chairs?" And he's Picard's just like, no, he's trying to explain. Now, let me explain to you. And he's like, fine, just have your Klingon servant bring us some chairs. And he's like, I'm chief of security. And it's like, well, then who brings the chairs? That was a funny bit. And I think a lot of the reviews and all their opinions I saw in this episode pretty much all agree that was a funny bit. I did really like that. And, Picard's response is after explaining he can't have his aides there, he's like, and you can have my chair. It was kind of funny. And he wasn't too bad for the rest of the episode. As I said, he barely appears in it. He just, makes some slight comments about the Federation or whatever, and he does that, that play acting at the end of the episode where he's threatening to destroy the wormhole. And then you see those other Ferengi who go off in the Delta Quadrant with or go through the wormhole. They think they're going to the Gamma Quadrant, but they're going to the Delta Quadrant, and they're being like dicks to Geordi. Like, I think they work in that scene too. They're like, we're competitors, not partners in this. Stop calling us. And Geordi's like, well, not, good travels to you too. Like, that was cool. I think that was good use of them. And then being like putting the poison on as time to extend the hand of the Federation, like to where he poisons the ambassador to try to eliminate him. So that's all well and good. Like, that all works for me. But apparently there's a scene which I noticed for the first time, or maybe I noticed it before, but it never really clicked with me. But I can't remember which scene. I think it's when Devanali Rawl is talking to that Caledonian, or whatever that dude's name with the big head. In 10-4, the scene starts out, though. It's sort of, the camera pans over, and you don't see the dialogue because it's like a long shot in the distance. He's kind of in the background, but the camera is kind of focusing on Goss at the bar of 10-4, and he's hitting on the woman, and he's like doing like this with his hands. And I just read this trivia that apparently he's supposed to be saying trying to make out how the size of his member with his hands, and that's why the woman walks away after he does that. Now, I did not know that. That seems like a Roddenberry addition to the script to me. But anyway, and then another woman comes and sits down at the bar, and then he walks over to her to start hitting on her. But then the camera pans and changes over to Devanali Rawl and the Caledonian, and we actually they focus on them more, because this is like, as I said, it was like a long shot, and you weren't focused on them. You couldn't actually hear what he was saying. But anyway, it was very quick too, so that's why I hadn't really noticed it before. But I also think that's that's very in character for the Ferengi, or at least how we'll know them going forward. So maybe it's establishing their character, in fact. But yeah, it seems very Ferengi-alike. So next, I guess I want to talk about the whole Gamma Quadrant, Delta Quadrant thing, because this is the first episode that establishes the different quadrants, and specifically the Delta and Gamma Quadrant. Now, one can infer that there's, quadrant, there's 4 of them, but they don't actually use the terms Alpha and Beta Quadrant in this episode, so that comes later. But yeah, one can infer that those are the 2 faraway quadrants from the context of this episode. And because it's funny, because when I was watching Q-Who, when Q flung the Enterprise in front of the Borg, I was actually listening to see if they used the term Delta Quadrant, but they didn't. But now that I realize they hadn't even come up with that term yet, it was like they didn't even establish that Delta Quadrant was a thing until this episode. But even when Q or Data described how far they were away from Federation space, it seemed like they were still in the Alpha and Beta Quadrant. It seems like they weren't all the way to the Delta Quadrant, just extrapolating from how long it would take them to get there. But a lot of supplemental material and guidebooks and whatnot would establish that the Borg were from the Delta Quadrant, even though it wasn't stated in Q-Who. And so even before Voyager made it canon that they were from the Delta Quadrant, I was like most Star Trek fans at the time were aware that they were from the Delta Quadrant. But anyway, that's getting off topic. What's interesting here is this episode pretty much is the basis for both the premises of Deep Space Nine and Voyager, which is pretty wild to think about, that this, not very middling, not very well liked episode from the 3rd season that most people forget about is actually what establishes the lore that is really at the heart of Deep Space Nine and Voyager, because Deep Space Nine, of course, establishes the real first stable wormhole to the Gamma Quadrant. And it's funny because that's what they think they have here. And it's funny if someone saw Deep Space Nine before they saw this episode, and they're like, oh, we just, the Barzans discovered the first stable wormhole to the Gamma Quadrant, might be like, what? But that's happens later in Deep Space Nine. But of course, you find out here that it's not actually stable. And they're, studying it to see the merits of it. And from what they said, like Data describes, that would take about 90 years, I believe he says, to get to the point in the Gamma Quadrant at Warp 9. And I think Deep Space Nine established it was like 70 years or 80 years away, if I am not too mistaken. So I think this is deeper into the Gamma Quadrant than what the Bajoran wormhole goes. So it's probably nowhere near each other. But that is interesting that they took the concept, and of course Michael Piller helped develop Deep Space Nine, and he helped write this episode, so maybe he got the idea from recalling this episode of, oh, we had the stable wormhole to the Gamma Quadrant, what if we do that for our show and make that a thing? And make it actually be stable this time, instead of unstable. But then when Data and Geordi go through the wormhole, they of course find themselves in the Delta Quadrant, which is, establishes it for Voyager. And in fact, it ends with the Ferengi shuttle getting stranded in the Delta Quadrant, which is exactly what happens to Voyager. That's the whole premise of that show, a ship getting stranded in the Delta Quadrant. And funnily enough, they do in fact come across these Ferengi, these same two Ferengi, in the Delta Quadrant. And it's funny because I think that this episode seemed to imply, like Picard seemed to say, oh, they'll reach it in 80 years. But I thought Voyager said that they were 70 years away, or maybe that was 70,000 light years. Maybe it was 80 years. I don't know. But Voyager seemed to be further away than the Ferengi went, because it took them like 3 years to actually get to the point, traveling towards the Alpha Quadrant to get to the point where the Ferengi were. But anywho, I was hoping that the Ferengi, that they would show these two Ferengi in Voyager when that Voyager first came out. I was like, hey, that Ferengi were trapped in the Delta Quadrant from the episode The Price. They should show them hooking up with them. And in the third season, they finally did. I was like, oh yes, they're doing the thing that I wanted them to do. But then that episode ended up sucking, being quite bad. So I was like, God, yeah, I wish they would have done something better with it than this BS. But anyway, but then Prodigy comes along and like destroys the whole concept of quadrants being very far away, and ships are able to instantly travel around the whole galaxy like it's nothing. And there's Ferengi just hanging out in the Delta Quadrant for no good goddamn reason. And there's Tellarites and all these other people in the Delta Quadrant that shouldn't be there. But anyway, that's off topic. So yeah, the scene where I do like the scenes with Geordi and talking to the Ferengi, trying to convince them to go back to the wormhole, trying to convince them that they're in the Delta Quadrant, they're not where they shouldn't be. And I heard some people say that they thought it was unrealistic that the Ferengi wouldn't like believe them and wouldn't know instantly they're in the Delta Quadrant because they have maps, they have sensors, they should be able to tell where they are. But I actually do buy that the Ferengi are that dumb. I mean, the whole way, especially they're portrayed in this episode, I totally buy they're that dumb and stubborn, more to the point, and just willing to be like, oh, we're going to win, we're going to get the profits, we're going to have sole control of the wormhole if we stay, and the idiots that get themselves stranded. And I also heard people complain that the Ferengi's reaction to the wormhole just disappearing and stranding them like in the middle of fucking nowhere in this tiny little shuttlecraft, and the reaction is just to go But again, I totally buy that as well. I mean, they might have a bigger reaction, like a different reaction later on. But like, when something like you realize you fucked up so badly, your first, like in an instant, your first reaction is going to be, fuck. And so I totally buy that as their reaction. And I also like how Geordi called them idiots. He was like, idiots, and just went through the wormhole without them. And, and it makes sense that he has the Federation. He's a good guy. He wouldn't want anyone to get stranded there. And he's like begging them, like, come on, you got to come back. But they're not listening. He's like, well, I'm not going to fucking get stranded here just because they're idiots. And so he goes back. And then some people has criticized Picard's flippant reaction to when Damon Goss asked where his men are. He just tells Worf, oh, just let them know that point him in the right direction and say if you leave now you could get there in like 80 years or so. I mean, those two people, as far as are like dead. They just signed a death sentence and die a horrible, lonely death in this tiny little shuttle pod in space all alone. Of course, he didn't know that they would find this planet that they could exploit and become gods, but that was just very happenstance. It was very lucky for them that they happened to find that they didn't just die being stuck in that tiny little shuttle pod. So it was kind of flippant of Picard to do that, and of course the episode, the way it was written, it was obviously done for comedic effect, but it's like, is that really that funny that those two people just, are going to die this horrible death alone in this tiny little closet trapped in the middle of nowhere? And I think, yeah, it kind of is. Because it's their own damn fault. Because Geordi repeatedly tried to warn them over and over again and be like, look, we're in the wrong place. This wormhole's not stable. You gotta come back. And they're like, oh, stay here. You're just coward. And so, yeah, they fucking deserve it. So I kind of am okay with Picard making light of the situation. So call me cruel or whatever, but I think, yeah, they get what they coming to them. Anyway, speaking of the little shuttle pods, I'm wondering as I'm watching this episode, because they know that they're traveling through a wormhole. They know it's taking them to a distance very, very, very far away. They are told that it's stable, but they have not, confirmed that yet. In fact, Picard, when Riker first said, oh yeah, we should send the team on the shuttle through the wormhole, Picard at first was like, no, we should get some more information on the wormhole, and then if it checks out, then we'll go tomorrow. So it's even after they checked it out, it's still a very precarious situation. As it turns out, they could have easily gotten stranded in the middle of nowhere. So it was a very sort of dangerous, iffy thing that they were doing. So why the hell did they take this puny, tiny little shuttle pod instead of a bigger shuttlecraft? I mean, really, that shuttle pod that LaForge and Data were in was like the size of a car, maybe a van, basically. And they were like crammed in the front seat in this tiny, tiny, tiny little shuttle pod that who knows if it's even warp capable. And if it is warp capable, it's probably not a very high speed. So why didn't they take an actual shuttlecraft that was warp capable and was bigger and actually had a bit more supplies? Now, granted, if they got stranded in the middle of the Delta Quadrant, being in a shuttlecraft wouldn't make their situation that much better. They would still be fucked. But still, so I wouldn't have, made a huge difference, but still, at least they wouldn't be crammed in this tiny little space where they could, I don't know. It's just always got me, why not take a shuttlecraft? It's just a thing. Anyway, I think shuttlecrafts have bathrooms. I don't even know if those little shuttle pods would have bathrooms. They're so tiny. But anyway, how is Geordi supposed to be? It's really a short-range... Okay, I made my point. Let me move on. I just don't get it. So let me now finally get to the heart of the episode. Definitely Raul, who is played by Matt McCoy, I think his name was. And when I first saw this episode, as I said, I saw it after it was released, I recognized this actor from the movie The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. Because even though that movie came out after this episode, I saw the movie first before I saw this episode. And he played the husband in that movie, which at the time I kind of liked, but looking back on it, it's kind of not very good. I mean, it was okay, but it's just your standard thriller. It was like, it was huge at the box office, though. I remember it being like number one for like 8 weeks in a row, and I don't know if most people today have even heard of it. I think it came out in 91, I think. But yeah, as I said, after this episode, because this episode came out late 89. But anywho, I also saw him later on in Seinfeld in the Serenity Now episode. Serenity Now. What did he say? Serenity Now, but insanity later. Yeah, that's what he said. But anyway, and I saw that after both of these things that I saw. So I was like, hey, it's that dude who's in Star Trek and Hand of Rock's Cradle. And I've seen him in a couple other things as well. There was just something on IMDb I was like looking up. Oh, LA Confidential. He was in that. I was like, oh yeah, that's right. He played like an actor who was playing a cop on TV. I'm not a cop, but I play one on TV. And he has that look of the typical handsome actor, kind of thing. So that would be kind of good for him. In fact, I don't know if I quite buy him in this role. I don't know. So, I don't know. It's hard to say. I'm trying, I try to analyze whether or not this actor this character would have came off better if it was a different actor, or if it's really just the writing that's the problem. I don't know. It's hard to say because the writing is a bit inconsistent. So, this is the thing with this character, is that the romance that he has with Deanna Troi does really come off as a bad romance of the week. Now, I was just doing a live stream about yesterday's Enterprise, which, it comes a little bit later in Season 3, and how amazing the romance was between Yar and Shooter McGavin, Lieutenant Castile. And, and they barely showed those two together, and yet the romance really worked, and it worked much better than romances that they do spend more time on and are more the focus of the episode. For example, this one. This one they spend more time on, and it reminded me a bit of the Dax and Goodwin romance from the Deep Space Nine episode. What was it called? Meridian, which was one of the worst romance episodes of all time, one of the worst on-screen romances. And this one reminded me of that a lot, because I don't know, because they were very, lustful for each other at first, but then all of a sudden they start talking seriously, Raul opens up to Deanna about his deepest feelings, and talking about how he wants to run away with her. I don't. I'm not feeling that. I don't buy it at all. I mean, I buy that, they sleep with each other. They both want to have some fun, whatever. But the fact that he would instantly be deeply in love with her and she would share those feelings is no. I'm sorry, I don't buy it. And that's the problem with this romance, is that it was inconsistent. Well, first of all, the first scene, he comes off really, really cheesy, really 80s-ish. Just hanging out, hi, I'm definitely Raul, and having that hot chick hanging off his shoulder. And then in the next episode, or the next scene, he talks about how he sent her away, and, Troy's like, why? And he's like, you know why? Because I want to get it on with you. Oh, yeah. Anyway, and that's just and he's like touching her, like running his hand up her shoulder, and saying, "Oh, you're the counselor," blah blah. And he's being really fucking creepy, really goddamn creepy in this scene. And I just don't buy that Troy would fall for that. And the fact that she does fall for that makes me lose a lot of respect for her. I don't know. You could say I'm being unfair. I do know instances in real life where women do fall for the cheesy, sleazy routine, which has disgusted me. So it does work, but someone like Troy, who's like a professional and a psychologist and understands, it seems like she would be able to see through acts like this. And oh yeah, I didn't even mention the start of the episode where Troy is like talking about being like had a rough day and just wants to relax, but Picard calls her to go to the to the celebration in Tim Ford, and she's like, "Oh God, you're fucking." She's being all grumpy. Kind of didn't buy that either. Kind of seemed a bit inconsistent for her character. But to be fair, her character hasn't been that well established by this stage, but it still seemed a little bit out of character for her. But anyway, so yeah, Raul is very creeping on her. And then the next scene, I think it's better. Like, he's not as creepy, and oh yeah, it's when he's like, champagne for two. He's still being sleazy, but not as creepy, so I can like buy it a little bit more. And then they sleep together, and then the next scene you see him like giving her a foot massage or something. I guess he's the foot fucking master. Sorry, Pulp Fiction reference. Sorry, I just had to throw that in there. You give her a foot massage. Anyway, he's giving her a foot massage, and I believe it's this scene or later, and we see them sort of implied sex going on, and then he confesses that he's a telepath, and he's talking about wanting to run away from her. So that didn't seem earned at all. As I said, it seemed like a fling. At first he's being super creepy and she should have rejected him outright. Then he's being not as creepy and they have a little one-night stand, which is fine. But then all of a sudden, just because I guess Troy's a sucker for foot massages, he's talking about loving each other and running away together. And by the way, he confesses to her that he's 1/4 Betazoid and that he can, sense people's feelings. Why did he do that? I'm just playing like devil's advocate here because Troy at the end calls him out and reveals his big secret to everyone, and he loses because of that. He's in deep shit. His career's in trouble. And don't get me wrong, Troy did the right thing. I totally side with her, and I think she was right to do it. But from Devanali Rao's perspective, why did he tell her this? It seemed like a dumb thing to do. Again, this is where the part where I don't buy their closeness comes in. Because if I would buy that that they were close. Like, when I first saw this episode, I missed the first 5 minutes of it, and I recorded it off the TV, so every time I watched it, it was missing the first 5 minutes, so I missed the part where he first showed up with that girl on his shoulder. So when Troy was talking about a traveling companion, I didn't know what the fuck she was talking about, and it wasn't until like several years later when I got the DVD, I finally got to see that opening scene. But when I first saw this episode, I thought that they knew each other already because they were talking kind of like they had this established, like, oh, you're the stop being the counselor with me. That sort of bullshit. Like, it was acting like he already knew her and she already knew him, yet they just met each other. And so they just met each other. They slept together once and had some champagne together. And all of a sudden, he's telling her his deepest, darkest secrets that would really come to bite him in the ass. So it doesn't seem like he's that smart of a guy, which is at odds with the rest of the episode, because the rest of the episode, he's actually very good at manipulating people. He's a very good negotiator. He's very manipulative and good at getting what he wants. So this him just blurting out, "Oh, by the way, I'm an empath," seemed very out of character for him. It seemed very at odds, and I think I would only buy it if I could buy that he was in love with her and that he felt that close to her. He felt close enough to reveal that deep of a secret, which I do not at all buy. I do not at all buy that he was that close to her, that he would do something that was obviously stupid from his perspective. That was such a dumb thing to do. And I'm kind of thinking that while I'm watching that scene, it's like, why are you telling her this? That's so stupid of him. Now, I want to get more into the moral argument that they have, that Troy and Devon will have, because it's actually kind of interesting. So, Troy points out that he is manipulating people, that he doesn't tell people that he's an empath, and he uses his empathic abilities to find out what their weakness is and exploit it for his own personal gain, and says that's immoral and that that he has a problem with ethics. And he shoots back that while she doesn't tell like the Romulans or every visiting alien that she's an empath, and when she senses that the Romulan is bluffing, she doesn't tell that to the Romulan, she tells that to her captain for her advantage, for her ship, her crew, her advantage. And then he makes the argument that, when I do it, it's just for a bit of property, but when you do it, it's life and death. So which of us has a deeper problem with ethics? And he almost convinced me, actually, and I had to think about this long and hard, because he actually makes a really good argument, which is in his character, by the way, because he's seen as this really good negotiator who's good at arguing. And so that made me think that, well, maybe he makes a point. But then ultimately, after I thought this over, I decided that he's actually wrong, that he is, while he makes a good argument, he's kind of being disingenuous, and that's the main point, that he is disingenuous, that he lies to people. He introduces himself as a human, and people assume or are told that he's human, so they think he doesn't have empathic abilities when he definitely does. That is being purposely deceptive. Now, when you take the analogy of, does Troy tell every single Romulan, adversary that she's an empath? No, but she doesn't tell them that she's human either. She doesn't even talk to them at all. She has no interaction with them. Or even if they go in that conference room, say there's like a negotiation with them, does she, let them know outright that she's a Betazoid? I don't know. That's actually a good question. Like, I'm thinking of the episode Chain of Command when she's in negotiation with the 3 Cardassians and she's sitting at the table with them. Do those Cardassians know that she's a Betazoid? They might. Maybe that's somewhat, open information. I don't know. That's an interesting thought process. But regardless of whether or not those Cardassians know, she doesn't present herself as, I'm definitely human and I definitely don't have empathic powers. But that is what definitely Ram does. And also, in a situation with a life or death situation when like they're talking about, like, she doesn't have every day-to-day interactions with like a Romulan on an attacking ship or anything like that. Mostly she won't have any interactions with them at all. Now if they're doing negotiations, that's different, but even then, like, I feel like most negotiations or conferences and stuff like that, I feel like everyone there would be aware that she's a Betazoid. I think there are some examples where Picard is upfront about that, or that they're already aware of this. Like, for example, this episode where Rawl already knows, and everyone at the negotiating table knows that she's a Betazoid. Like, she doesn't hide this in friendly negotiations. In life or death, like battle situations, that is totally different because they don't have that interaction. She doesn't introduce her. Oh, hi, you're about to attack my ship. I'm Deanna Troi. I'm definitely not a telepath. Like, they don't have that interaction, whereas definitely Rawl has every day-to-day interactions the same way Troy is doing in this very episode, where everyone knows she's a telepath. However, here, he introduces himself as human. He doesn't let anyone know of his Betazoid heritage, so he is purposely being deceptive. There's a difference. That's the difference. In fact, in that life and death situation, she does it to save lives. Now, it might inadvertently end up ending some lives, as he points out, but her main purpose is to save lives. And as I said, she's not being purposely deceptive the way he's being purposely deceptive. So no, his point's actually bullshit. He almost had me going, but actually, because that's a credit to the writer of the episode, because it shows that he's good at manipulating people, he's good at arguing, he's good at negotiating, and I think that he was convincing himself of that too. I think he believed his own lies in this case, and you notice how as soon as he said that, he said, "Excuse me," he got up and left before Troy could rebut, because he didn't want to take a rebuttal, and he was acting all offended, which I don't know if he really was. I think he just wanted to get the hell out of there before she, tore his weak argument apart. And pointing out what I just did, that he is purposely being deceptive in a way that she doesn't. But, anywho, and manipulative, by the way. What Troy does is not manipulative in the same way that he actively manipulates people. So it's interesting seeing him throughout the episode, the way he deals with the Caledonian, and is able to get him to drop out by playing off of his fears. And we see he plays off of the Barzan's fears of the, Starfleet being too militaristic. You see him doing that from the very beginning, by the way. He keeps hammering the point home. The Crusalians are at war with no one. We're at war with no one. We have peace. Like, he keeps hammering that point home. And it's obvious is because he can sense from her that she's worried about Starfleet being too aggressive and too militaristic, or bringing conflict to her world, and that's why he keeps hammering the point home. Now, they also talk about how, like, the scene with him and Riker, I gotta talk about this because I love this scene. I think it's easily the best scene of the episode, where Riker, he tries to manipulate Riker in the same way he manipulated the Caledonian, and it fails. But more to the point, they point out in that scene that there would come down to them two, that they're the only real, like, negotiators, the only real threats to each other in that room, and that Rawl recognizes that. In fact, he even says that to Troy, that he recognizes that Riker is his biggest threat. Which is also good, because I like how Riker had to take over for the ambassador. And this makes a lot of sense to me. It makes way more sense than him being a prosecutor and a measure man. But, and I think Riker does a really good job. And he does play off his natural skills. And I like how the ambassador even noticed that Riker had these natural skills, the poker skills, as they said, even before, the ambassador was taken out. And so he recognizes Riker's his biggest threat, and so he goes to try to play off of Riker's fears, and so he says that he's ready to reach an agreement with the Barzans before Data and Geordi get back, and asks Riker if he's ready to do the same, which he isn't, and as we find out by the end of the episode, he's smart not to do that. But Raul is taking more of a risk taker. He's not playing it safe because he knows that he's in a losing position, so he needs to, really step up his game. And his goal is more than Riker's goal. Riker's goal is to, benefit the Federation and benefit the Barzans and, help out the Federation, where definitely Raul's goal is simply to win. He's in it to win, and that's it. So he tries to manipulate Riker with that, and then he talks about Deanna and how he says to Riker, like, oh, you could have had her, but you lost her, and now I'm going to take her too. And then throughout, like, all this conversation up to this point, Riker was, like, scowling and looking kind of pissed off. It's like, well, we'll see. We'll see how it goes. But as soon as he said the thing about Deanna, he had this, just got this huge smile on his face and said, that is the first bad move I've seen you make yet. And then he that was such a great moment. He just snaps him back hard and really shows how he is the better negotiator, particularly. And this was Raul making the wrong move, because I think he was kind of desperate and thought that this move would work. Maybe he was sensing the strong feelings that Riker has for Deanna, but misinterpreted those feelings as being sort of more romantic and lustful, where Riker was just truly in love with her, or loves her, I should say, not in love with her, although they get married later. But at this stage, let's say he loves her and generally wants her to be happy no matter who she's with. And he even plays that card, makes it clear, and says, she could probably bring some happiness to your smug, meaningless little life, but I don't think you're smart enough to take it. Like, that was just such a good scene. That was like such an awesome Riker moment of him just laying the hammer down on this arrogant prick who misstepped, and he just slapped him down for it. And if you notice, when we go from this scene, we immediately go from this scene to the scene where Damon Goss and Raul Damon Goss puts on that fake play for for the Barzan's benefit, so that because, and there's a reason why we go immediately to that scene, because after that moment where Riker just smacked him down hard, he knew he lost. I think he was already sensing from the Barzan that she was thinking of going with Riker, and that's why he went to Riker, because he knew that he was going to lose, and so his tactic was to try to knock Riker out the same way he knocked out the other guys, but that backfired on him big time, and so at that moment, he's lost. He's a goner. He knew that he lost, so he does this Hail Mary of getting the Ferengi to... we assume they negotiate with the Ferengi that, look, if you help me win negotiations, I'll give you free access, because otherwise the Federation is going to win. You're going to have no access. So he puts on the play and, threatens to, destroy the wormhole. And it's all an act so that, the Barzan woman would go with definitely Raul, because she's too afraid of the conflict that the Federation would bring. And then Troy calls him out on it. But here's the problem with this scene, is that Troy says that she felt no tension from Damon Goss at all, and no tension from definitely Raul. That it was like they were performing. But she can't sense Ferengi? Like, I don't know, did she deduce that from being an expert, in human behavior or alien behavior, humanoid behavior, I should say? Did she deduce that from his, his facial tics and the way he said? Because it's been firmly established in the 2 episodes the Ferengi appeared in previously, in the very first episode they appeared in, that Betazoids cannot sense Ferengi. And that's brought up again in Menage a Troi, that Betazoids cannot sense Ferengi. So how the hell does she know that he wasn't scared or he wasn't tense? Anyway, that's just that's a nitpick. A lot of people have pointed it out, but it deserves to be pointed out because, yeah, that is quite a huge flaw there that kind of annoys me. But anyway, so yeah, she calls him out on his bullshit, which, as I said, I agree with her doing it, but it just made me think, Rawl, you're an idiot. Why'd you tell her this? You should have known, and she even says that to him later. She's like, you should have known that I couldn't let you do that. And he's like, well, maybe my Betazoid senses be overwhelmed by my human emotions, which is quoting back what she said to him earlier. But yes, I don't know. I don't buy it. It just seemed like, because I don't buy the romance, maybe. But then when they had that scene where he goes to her, and again, he's trying to manipulate her into going with him and saying, look, I was the bad boy. Why don't you come with me and set me straight? And she's like, no, I'm sorry. I already got a job as counselor. Because at this stage, she's over him. And he's kind of dumb for trying. And it is kind of cold the way that he just, after she says, I already have a job with the counselor, he doesn't say anything to her. He just sidesteps around her and just leaves the ship. That was cold. And I think it was meant to be cold, but I don't think Troy really cares. He's like, fuck that guy. He can walk out of here without talking to me. I don't give a shit at that point. She saw him for the, schwammy little, what's the word I'm looking for? Schwamme's little scruffy looking nerve herder. Sleazeball, that's the word I'm looking for. Sleazeball. She saw him for the sleazeball that he was. But why she didn't see that from the very beginning, I don't buy. But anyway, a couple more little things I want to talk about. First is, this is the episode where we see Deanna Troi and Dr. Crusher and their little leotards, doing these yoga. They describe it as yoga. It looks like more like, I don't know, like Pilates or some sort of exercise. And it's a really weird scene. I remember when I first saw this when I was younger, I thought, oh, well, they're having the two women sort of talk and relate to each other as women, which is how I think it was written, because the script was written by a woman, and so I think it was meant to be like the only two main women on the cast sort of relating to each other and just having a personal conversation, which I do like. However, doing it while they're wearing revealing clothing and doing those sexy poses and yoga that sort of, show off their ass and stuff like that, that seemed more like a directorial decision maybe, and that was very sort of definitely trying to make it really sexy. I don't even know if in the script they had it as yoga. I would guess maybe they just made that up, or maybe they did. But and I was trying to think that if we ever saw them do this again in later episodes. I thought that they did, but when I looked it up, that they didn't. Apparently, this is the only episode they did that in. I know that they showed Beverly and Deanna working out with Worf's calisthenics thing, where they were wearing these white robes, but that was sort of less sexy and less revealing. Especially the poses they would do. And it's funny because they were having this casual conversation, about love or whatever, and they would just do these weird complex poses where they sit and put their legs out and touching each other, or touching the legs, the feet against each other, and they would they each do that, when one would do that and they were in unison, they were that just seemed, while they were having a casual conversation, that just seemed fake. I think the word, I don't know, and especially with the mirrors there to show off their, and the revealing clothing. So that was recently parodied in Lower Decks, where they had the two male, the most manliest men characters on that show, the handsome first officer and the buff security chief, go and do the same thing, and they were doing the exact same poses, and they were wearing the same exact revealing clothes and doing the same poses as they're having a casual conversation. And when you see that scene, you're like, oh my god, that's so... someone who didn't know what they were referencing, who hadn't seen this episode, for example, would see that scene like, looks so ridiculous. Like, what the fuck are they doing? This is so petty. This is so cheesy, but it's meant to illustrate how cheesy this scene is. By showing like how kind of sexist the scene is too, by having to show off their revealing things. So let's instead have these two manly men do it, and that will reveal just how stupid this scene is, and it works. And apparently there was a tweet of Gates McFadden. When someone pointed this out to her, she was like, her response was hilarious. So yeah, I'm sure she appreciated it as well. So yeah, so I had to bring that up. The other thing I had to bring up, which is also related to Modern Trek, is the Barzans. This is the first episode that introduced the Barzan, and we don't see them again until all the way until Discovery, where they introduced the character of Security Chief Nan, who's on the Enterprise, but then transferred over to Discovery and then went with them into the future, into the 31st. Is it 31st or 32nd century? Whatever century it is. She went with them. And I remember her saying that, revealing that when she went into Starfleet, like, her family forbade it, and that the Barzans were sort of isolationists, which is not how they're portrayed here, but Discovery took place, or at least the time she's from, took place 100 years before this episode. So it stands to reason in the 23rd century, maybe they were isolationists and didn't really want their people joining Starfleet. But in this episode, they're portrayed more as not isolationist, but more of insignificant and not really a power, and not really having that much infrastructure or power as far as interstellar community goes. And that's why they needed to sell this wormhole in order to use it to obtain more resources and more power and more sort of standing. And they were willing to work with the Federation. But as I said, this was 100 years after Discovery. And when Discovery did go into the 30-whatever century, they revealed that the Barzans did in fact join the Federation, which makes sense by that time, by that stage. So, yeah, that's just another little interesting tidbit. It's interesting how much this episode plays into future shows and how important this one episode is, even though it's not particularly that great. Anyway, I want to go ahead and thank my Patreon supporters for supporting me on Patreon. It is very much appreciated. It does help me continue with my channel. I am very thankful, very humbled by your support. So I'll just give a quick shout out to Tetson, Greg Marley, Francisco Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky Manigester, Joel Valls, Alessandro Miglasio, Norman Buckwald, Stephen Kennedy, Britton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neil Howells. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. So, we have quite a few Patreon comments for this episode. First comment is from Norman Buckwald, who says, "No prize, please. Troy wants a real chocolate sundae and instead gets total scum for her trouble, while two Ferengis get stuck in the Delta Quadrant who in the future make Janeway and crew look like total idiots. Only plus part was how Riker handled the scum, and Troy herself thankfully eventually puts the scum in his place. 2 wandering wormholes out of 10. Yeah, I forgot to talk about the Troy. This is the first episode they introduced Troy's love for chocolate. And I kind of got annoyed at the replicator when she asked for real chocolate. The replicator was like, "Oh, we only serve nutritious food." I'm like, "Fuck you, replicator. Mind your own goddamn business." But the thing is that Troy is like, when after the replicator said that, the replicator even said, "Do you want me to override?" So apparently it's just as easy. It's just reminding you, hey, you're being unhealthy, but if you want to, you go for it, just tell me. But Troy's response was, hey, look. Like, she's talking to a replicator. She should know this should be an everyday thing for her. She shouldn't, instead of saying, hey, look, she should just say, yes, override. Mind your own goddamn business. Anyway, I mean, it kind of makes sense because they have synthahol and sugar is super, super bad for you. So it does seem like in the future that is something that they would have a substitute for and avoid or whatever. But still, it's like, mind your own damn business, replicator. Anyway, next comment is from Kyrie091 who says, the price, more like the lice. Actually, I don't hate this episode, and I really like that they followed up on this episode with Voyager with these jabronis. Yeah, that wasn't one of your best ones either. Anyway, next comment is from Tetzen, who says, is this the one where Troy and Beverly sexy pose? And I never understood the whole Troy not being able to snitch on Devonali Raw because she also uses her empathic powers. Surely Troy should have told Picard immediately. Not a good look for an officer. Imagine if it were race. I can't tell my captain important info because the other guy is black like me. This part always left me feeling weird. So, I don't think it's because they're both Betazoids. I don't think that's why she's withholding the information. I think she's withholding the information because he trusted her with that information and she doesn't want to betray his trust. Because he told her in confidence. It's kind of like the doctor-patient confidentiality. I think that has more to do with it than, this is a fellow Betazoid, so I don't want to tell him my fellow Betazoid. I think it's more of a, he trusted me with this information, and I'm betraying his trust by telling people. And so, which I totally buy, and I also totally buy her decision to betray that trust because he crossed the line. And she makes that clear to him later where she tells him, like, you should have known that I couldn't let you get away with that. Because she was, like, uncertain about the morality involved, but as soon as he did that, play acting thing, he's like, okay, he crossed the line, and I now feel justified in revealing this information, even though it was privileged. So anyway, that's how I look at it. Next comment is from Stephen Kennedy, who says, this episode is boring. The subplot with the Ferengi is the only good thing about this love triangle with two Betazoids and Riker. I wonder who scored more, Troy or Riker, for being cough of the Enterprise and then end up married. So at least they knew each other's indiscretions. My rating is 5 false prophets out of 10. I think Riker scored more easily. I mean, that's not even a contest. Come on. I mean, Troy scored a couple times, but geez. Anyway, Riker's like every other episode. Anyway, next comment is from Brandon Neilhouse, who says, the price is too high for me. Although I have to give this episode credit for sowing the seeds of Deep Space Nine and introducing us to 4 quadrants, this episode would drive me to eat the unhealthiest chocolate sundae in the universe. Devonali Raw is a sleaze, and I'm puzzled why Troy is drawn to him. Surely they're getting intimate during the negotiations is a conflict of interest? Then the Ferengi show up and the whole story goes to shit. Interesting to notice that gold-pressed latinum hasn't been invented yet. As for Deanna and Beverly's exercise routine, the less said, the better. Seriously, what the fuck are they wearing? 2 Klingon servants bringing chairs out of 10. I love that. Or just have your Klingon servant bring me some chairs. I am chief of security. Then who gets the chair? Sorry. I did really like that routine. The gold pressed platinum, a lot of people brought it up that he, gives a thing of gold and says, I'll give you all this gold, but later in Deep Space Nine, Quark says the gold is useless. Which I think that actually contradicts something that Quark said earlier in Deep Space Nine as well. So I think that was the episode Who Mourns for Morn. I think that episode, they shouldn't have said that. I think they were being inconsistent by saying that gold is useless, and it's really the latinum that's encased in the gold. If gold's so useless, then why are they using it to encase latinum in it? Of course, Quark even says that in that episode. But anyway, they hadn't thought up as gold pressed latinum yet. That's a Deep Space Nine thing, so I have no problem with him giving gold. It's just a production thing. I go with it. Not saying that you do. I know you don't either. Anyway, you're also saying that... What else was in here? Devonali Rawl and Troy is surely, them getting intimate during the negotiations is a conflict of interest. Less of a conflict of interest than Riker sleeping with the leader of Angel One when they were on a diplomatic mission to that planet. Riker. Anyway, I don't think that's much of a conflict of interest because she's not involved in the negotiation. If she was the negotiator, not Riker, then that would be a big conflict of interest. But she's just on the ship that's hosting. So, I don't think so. But I don't know. Definitely not as much as what Riker does. Anyway, final comment is from Ricky, who says, I actually think this is an okay episode. Troy falling in love with this part telepathic guy was kind of boring, and of course he is a liar and a thief, and it's so obvious that he is using Troy. The story with the wormhole was interesting, and I did get a kick out of the Ferengi being stuck in the Delta Quadrant, so nothing special. But what really saved the episode and what made it not get a negative rating is the scene where Troy's lover was antagonizing Riker, that he is better and that Troy would never be with him and Troy prefers him, and then Riker looks at him, smiles, and says, nothing would please me more than for Deanna to be happy. That is one of Riker's best moments, in my opinion. Instead of giving into anger, he gives a completely surprising answer to this guy. So with this scene, it's an okay episode, so my rating is a 6 out of 10. One thing I was wondering and I was asking myself is, was Riker being sincere when he said that to Devonali Rawl, or was he sort of play acting to do a negotiation tactic? And I think the episode is clearly trying to tell us that he is in fact being sincere, because Devonali Rawl has empathic abilities, so if Riker was lying, he would be able to sense it. But even that, let's say his empathic abilities aren't that good or being impaired by something or whatever, I still think Riker was being sincere when he said those things, that nothing would make him happy to see Deanna Troi happy. And that's why it was such a devastating blow, that he so misread Riker, and the fact that he was sincere, I think, was what made it more powerful. Anyway, my rating for The Price. My rating for The Price out of 10 is a 6 good. So before I started to see, like last time I watched season 3 during my season long review, I said I gave this season no negative ratings, and I said that at the start of the season when I started reviewing it. I was saying how great the season is, saying I gave no negative ratings, but I'm not holding fast to that. Like, I'm not gonna refuse to give an episode a 5, because that would tarnish, that would change it, so that would be a negative rating, and it would no longer be true that no episode of season 3 has a negative rating. But I'm not going to hold myself to that. I'm going to judge each episode on its own merit as I watch, because I do change my mind from time to time. Like last week when I watched The Enemy, last time I gave that episode a 7, I think. I've given it a 6 before, and I gave it an 8 last time, because I changed my mind. Like, I watched this episode and I judged it on its own merits. I analyzed it very deeply, try to pay close attention, and give my rating accordingly to, after what I think about really thinking about the episode. And so if I want to give an episode of season 3 a 5, I will, even though it will change the results of, no episode of season 3 gets a negative rating. I'm going to be honest. And it's this episode and Menage a Troy coming up towards the end of the season. Those are the two episodes I'm most worried about changing my mind on and giving a negative rating to. Maybe Hollow Pursuit. No, not really Hollow Pursuits. I don't think I'm that worried about that one. It was mainly this one and Menage a Troy, which I think are the two clear worst episodes of this season, or I should say least good episodes of this season. But after honestly analyzing this episode and thinking about it, I really do think it deserves a 6. Not quite a 7 though, but I think I have a lot of issues with it, which is why I was thinking I might drop below a 6 because of the bullshit with the romance with Troy and Davanali Raw was just really mishandled. It was a bad Romance of the Week episode. The actor, I don't know if it's the actor who's bad or it's the director or maybe the writer, just a combination of all. It's just his performance just didn't really work in this episode. I don't know, something about it I just didn't really buy, and I didn't really buy the interactions between Troy, him and Troy. And yeah, it wasn't that great of an episode either. The stuff with the Ferengi could be silly at times, but that scene where Riker tells off Davanali Rawl, and really, really hammers it to him, that's what clinched it to me. That's what made it sure this is definitely getting a 6 at least for that scene alone. And then you combine that with, I think the comedy with the Ferengi kind of works. With, especially that bit with the chairs. I'm sorry, I love that bit with the chairs. I think that bit really works. And it introduced the concept of the Gamma Quadrant, the Delta Quadrant, and the wormhole. That was a pretty interesting backdrop for the episode. So yeah, with all those things combined, and the complexities of, the negotiations with Davanali Rawl, even if the romance was fumbled, I think, that earns this episode a positive rating. So I think it's earned its 6, so it's a solid 6. Not quite, I was even thinking about giving it a 7, but no, I think that the romance was so mishandled I can't in good conscience give it a 7, but I will give it a 6, which is higher than some some other people give it. But that's, so that is my rating for this episode. So that is it for my review of The Price. So I shall be back, let's see, today's Wednesday. Tomorrow, Thursday, I'll be back with my review of The Vengeance Factor. Now, this is an episode that a lot of people don't like as well. A lot of people will call this one of the lesser or the worst episode of season 3, or one of the worst. Spoilers. I actually really like this episode. There's no risk of me giving this episode a negative rating. I think this is an underrated episode that's actually really good. So, and I know everyone and their mother is going to disagree with me, but this is one of those times I'm going to boldly go in defiance of what everyone else's opinion is and talk about how much I like The Vengeance Factor. So then on Saturday, we'll get my revisited over on Patreon for The Defector. So for my Patreon supporters, I will revisit my review for The Defector. And then on Monday, another back here on my channel with another public review for The Hunted. And on Wednesday, another new review with The High Ground. The higher, the fewer ground. Anyway, till I reach the high ground. Anyway, so that's what's coming up on my channel. So be sure to check out my channel for all that and also as I cover many more Star Trek videos and many more videos on many other shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.